Right now, somewhere in what is now Jordan, a woman is kneeling beside a fire. She has spent hours gathering wild grains, not crops, not wheat from a farm, wild grasses growing wherever nature allowed them. She crushes the seeds between stones, mixes the powder with water, presses the paste onto a hot rock beside the flames. A thin flatbread begins to cook. 14,000 years later, archaeologists would find a burned fragment of that bread buried in the ashes. And it creates a strange problem. If humans were baking bread before farming existed, what exactly were they eating for the hundreds of thousands of years before fields, fences, and villages? The answer is far more complicated than most people imagine. For nearly all of human history, there was no such thing as a pantry, no grocery stores, no farms, no guaranteed next meal. Every morning began with the same question. What's available today? A few miles from that fire, another family wakes up. A child chews on a strip of dried meat left from yesterday. His grandmother is already preparing to leave camp, not to hunt, to gather. For a long time, people imagined ancient humans surviving mostly on meat. Researchers now know that isn't true. In many hunter-gatherer societies, plants provided a huge portion of daily calories. Roots, tubers, nuts, seeds, berries, wild fruits. The challenge was finding them and remembering where they grew. A successful gatherer wasn't simply lucky. They carried an entire map in their head. Which plants were ready this month? Which valley held edible roots? Which trees would fruit after the next rain? Knowledge was often more important than strength. And that creates another question. If plants were so important, why don't we find farms much earlier? Because wild plants came with a problem. Many of them were difficult or dangerous to eat. Imagine finding a large patch of wild yams. At first, it looks like free food. Then someone gets sick. Some wild varieties contain toxins. Others are almost impossible to digest raw. So ancient humans learned something that would change everything. Fire could transform food. A root that caused stomach pain became edible. A bitter plant became tolerable. A tough starch became energy. Long before humans understood chemistry, they were performing it. Every meal was an experiment. And we know this because ancient people left clues behind in surprising places. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers began studying hardened plaque on ancient teeth. Inside that plaque were microscopic starch grains, tiny remains of meals eaten thousands of years earlier. Scientists also examined preserved human waste found in caves. Not glamorous work, but incredibly useful. Seeds, pollen, fish scales, parasite eggs. All of them reveal what passed through someone's body on a specific day. Even bones tell stories. The chemicals locked inside ancient skeletons allow researchers to estimate whether someone relied more heavily on plants or animals. The evidence keeps pointing to the same conclusion. Ancient diets were far more diverse than most people think. Now imagine a different scene. A hunter has spent all day tracking a deer, hours of walking, hours of waiting. Eventually, he succeeds. The camp has meat. Problem solved. Except it isn't, because too much lean meat can actually be dangerous. Modern researchers call it protein poisoning, sometimes known as rabbit starvation. You can have a full stomach and still become weak, still become sick, still slowly starve. So hunter-gatherers weren't just chasing meat, they were chasing fat, marrow hidden inside bones, brains, oily fish, eggs, fat-rich insects. anything that packed more energy into fewer bites. When a large animal was killed, almost nothing was wasted. Bones were cracked open, organs were eaten, every calorie mattered. But what happened when there were no animals? The answer depended entirely on where you lived. On a rocky coastline, the tide pulls back. A woman walks across exposed stone carrying a basket. She doesn't need a spear. She doesn't need luck. Mussels cling to rocks by the hundreds. Crabs hide in shallow pools. Seaweed waits along the shoreline. For people living near the ocean, the coast was one of the most reliable food sources on Earth. We know this because entire hills of discarded shells still exist today. Archaeologists call them shell middens. Some contain the remains of thousands of meals spread across generations. They are proof that people returned to the same productive places again and again. Far inland, life followed a different calendar. One month brought berries, another brought grasshoppers, another brought migrating herds carrying valuable fat. Hunter-gatherers weren't surviving randomly. They were following schedules written by nature, and some groups became masters of timing. Along certain rivers, salmon arrived in such numbers that people could catch enormous quantities in a short period. But fish spoil quickly, so they invented another solution: smoke. Strips of salmon hung over fires until they dried. Food became portable. Food became storage. Food became time saved for later. That idea would become increasingly important, because once you can store food, you can stay in one place longer. And once you stay longer, new possibilities appear. But before we get there, there's another food worth talking about: honey. Imagine climbing a tree while thousands of angry bees circle your face. Most people wouldn't bother. Ancient humans absolutely did. Honey was one of the richest sources of sugar available in the natural world. And in parts of Africa, people developed an extraordinary partnership. A small bird called the honey guide would lead humans to bee nests. Humans opened the hive. The bird received leftovers. Both species benefited. It's one of the rare examples of cooperation between humans and wild animals that still exists today. By now, a pattern is beginning to emerge. There was no single ancient human diet. A person living in Arctic ice survived very differently from someone living in a tropical forest. Coastal communities ate differently from desert communities. Even neighboring groups often relied on completely different foods. The idea of one universal Paleolithic diet doesn't really fit the evidence. Ancient humans adapted to whatever environment surrounded them. And over time, they began doing something unexpected. They started changing those environments. Imagine a family returning to the same patch of wild tubers every year. As they dig, small pieces break off underground. The next season, more tubers grow, not because anyone planted them intentionally, just because human activity altered the landscape. The same thing happened with fire. People burned sections of grassland. Fresh plants appeared afterward. Animals followed the new growth. Hunters followed the animals. Small actions created predictable results. And predictability is powerful, because the hardest part of being a hunter-gatherer wasn't finding food. It was uncertainty, not knowing where the next meal would come from, not knowing what next season would look like, not knowing whether the weather would cooperate. The people who baked that bread in Jordan were beginning to solve that problem. Not with farms, not yet, but with experimentation, with storage, with repeated visits to the same places, with increasing control over their food supply. Archaeologists call these people the Natufians. They lived in the Levant roughly 14,000 years ago. Again and again, they returned to the same settlements. Grinding stones became common. Storage pits appeared. Wild grains were collected in huge quantities. For the first time, some communities were spending much of the year in one place. And then the climate changed. Around 12,900 years ago, a cooling period known as the Younger Dryas disrupted ecosystems across the region. Rainfall shifted, plant populations changed, food became less predictable. Groups faced a choice: keep moving or gain more control over the foods they depended on. Many researchers believe this pressure helped push people toward agriculture, not because someone invented farming overnight, but because thousands of small decisions started adding up. Store more seeds, return to productive areas, protect useful plants, gather earlier, plant a little, experiment, repeat, generation after generation, until something remarkable happened. Humans stopped following food. Food started following humans. And that's why that tiny piece of burned bread matters. It's more than an ancient meal. It's a snapshot of a species standing between two worlds. 1 foot in the life of hunter-gatherers, 1 foot in the future of farmers. The real question isn't what ancient humans ate. We know the answer was almost everything they could safely find. The more interesting question is this: after hundreds of thousands of years of living successfully as hunter-gatherers, what finally convinced us to stay in one place and plant the first field?